It began on a Thursday, one of those dull, metallic mornings where the light hits the countertop just wrong and every coffee stain feels like a metaphor. He brought his son back into the house without warning. "Only for a while," he said. Casually setting down the suitcase like it was nothing, I stood in the hallway, barefoot and unbrushed, still in the robe I wore for no one. My husband smiled, kissed my forehead, and returned to the kitchen, humming. His son followed behind, quieter, older than I remembered. But with that same way of watching people too closely, we hadn't seen each other in over 2 years. He looked different now. Broader shoulders, faint stubble along a jaw that hadn't been so sharp before. His eyes, though, still carried the same shade of withheld questions. I extended a polite hand, and he took it gently. But I noticed how he lingered just half a second longer than he should have. Or maybe I only imagined that part. The house became strange the moment he entered it. The air shifted, like furniture had been rearranged just a little off. He stayed. In the guest room down the hall, I heard him unpacking through the thin walls, his footsteps pacing slowly. That night, I turned in earlier than usual but didn't sleep. I lay listening to the muffled hum of the TV in the living room, the faint sound of water through pipes, the pause in his breathing as he moved around. My husband was busy with work, always distracted, in and out. He liked to keep the peace by avoiding what he didn't want to address. For him, this house was comfort and function. For me, it was a quiet collapse. We used to be close. Not romantically intense, not passionate in the movie's sense of the word, but steady, like folded laundry and Sunday eggs. But somewhere in that steadiness, I misplaced something. Something that made my skin remember it existed. That Friday morning, I walked into the kitchen to find him shirtless, drinking from the faucet like when he was a teenager. The sunlight cut across his back, tracing over the muscles with a kind of thoughtless cruelty. He turned, saw me, and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "Sorry," he said. "Didn't mean to wake you." I smiled, nodded, poured coffee. I should have looked away, should have tightened my robe. But I didn't. Instead, I asked if he still liked it black. He laughed, low and surprised, and took the cup. The days blurred. He was polite, distant, but always there. I noticed the details. How he smelled faintly like cedar soap and something metallic. How he rolled his sleeves unevenly. How he whistled when he cooked, badly, but always in tune with his own rhythm. I started dressing better around the house, not dramatically. I wasn't trying to seduce anyone, just softer fabrics, lighter perfume, silk under sweaters I never wore out. I told myself it was for me. One afternoon, we passed each other in the hallway. The narrowness made everything slower. My shoulder brushed against his chest. He looked down, not at me, not really, but enough to notice. I said nothing. He said nothing. But later that night, as I folded towels, I replayed that moment like it had lasted minutes. I told myself I was only lonely, that I missed feeling seen, that it was normal. Saturday, we sat outside. While my husband mowed the front yard, I handed him iced tea, our fingers grazing as he took the glass. The contact was too brief to call intentional, too long to ignore. He looked at me then, not as a stepson, not even as a guest, but as a man trying to figure something out. That night, I walked past his room. The door was half shut. I saw the glow of his laptop, the edge of his bed. I paused. The air was thick with that late summer warmth that clings to skin. I stood there for no reason, for too long. He didn't call out, didn't move. But I swear I felt his breath shift, like he knew I was there. I returned to my bedroom quietly. My husband was already asleep, mouth slightly open, arms thrown, wide like a man trying to own the bed and still failing. I lay beside him and stared at the ceiling. The fan made its usual soft rotations, like a slow, bored heartbeat. In the silence, I felt my own pulse in places I'd forgotten, and I knew this wasn't just a guest in our home anymore. He was becoming the mirror I didn't know I'd been avoiding, and something inside me had already begun to tilt. On Sunday, the house felt too quiet. even with the windows open and birds trying their best to sing through the heat. I lingered in the kitchen longer than usual, pretending to tidy up, though the space was already clean. I didn't want to go upstairs. My husband had taken his car to run errands, his version of giving everyone some space. He never asked what kind of space I needed, and maybe that was the problem. I heard the floor creak above, a soft, slow rhythm, footsteps, then the gentle knock of a drawer, the shuffling of fabric. His room. My breath caught in my chest. I told myself to ignore it, to do what I always did, deflect, redirect, bury. But something had shifted since Thursday. A thread had come loose, and the more I tried to pull it back into place, the more everything threatened to unravel. I climbed the stairs, deliberately slow, almost hoping the moment would pass by the time I reached the top. But it didn't. His door was ajar again, same as that first night. An invitation or an accident, I couldn't say. I knocked gently, against the frame, not waiting for an answer, and leaned in. He was folding shirts, back half turned to me. The room smelled like fresh laundry and citrus, clean but masculine, the kind of scent that lingers in memory longer than on skin. He glanced over his shoulder and smiled, polite but tired, like he hadn't slept well. "You doing laundry again?" I asked, already knowing the answer. He nodded. Didn't want to leave everything in the basket. Felt wrong. His voice was calm, measured, but there was an edge to it, something not quite indifferent. I stepped inside, closer than I needed. The air tightened between us. I felt every inch of it. My robe fluttered lightly at the hem. I had tied it, but loosely, and beneath it, the lace of my slip felt too present, too deliberate. I hadn't dressed for him. At least, that's what I kept telling myself. I could help fold, I offered, picking up a towel before he could reply. Our fingers brushed over the fabric. He didn't flinch, neither did I. We folded in silence, the quiet humming like a second presence in the room. Something neither of us named but both clearly felt. Outside, a car passed. Inside, the moment stayed. He moved closer, perhaps to grab another shirt, perhaps for something else. The scent of him, so sharp and warm, hit me all at once. I inhaled involuntarily. He looked at me, not with intention, not with guilt, but with clarity, as though he'd been holding something back and had just now decided to let it go. "I remember you being colder," he said, voice low. "Colder toward me." I smiled, bitterly. "I remember you being younger." He didn't laugh. Neither. Did I? The silence swallowed us again. I took the last folded shirt and pressed it into the stack. "There," I said. "All done." But I didn't move. Neither did he. And then, as if orchestrated by something entirely beyond my understanding, I stepped past him to leave, and his hand grazed my arm. Lightly, barely. But it was enough to stop me mid-step. Enough to melt something in my stomach. Something I hadn't felt in years. I turned to look at him. Just look. His hand still hovered near my skin, fingers open, waiting, but not pulling. Said nothing. He said nothing. There was no need. I moved closer, one breath apart, close enough to see the gold flecks in his irises, the faint scar near his chin, the way his mouth parted slightly but didn't speak. I shouldn't have leaned in, but I did, slowly, carefully, like it was something sacred. Our lips met with the hesitance of first-time offenders, soft, searching, wrong. And yet, there was no fire, no rush, just warmth, pressure, a fullness in my chest that didn't feel like panic, but presence. He didn't force. I didn't flee. We simply stayed there, suspended. Then a sound. A car door slamming outside. My husband. Reality. I pulled back, too fast, too hard. The robe nearly slipped off my shoulder and I clutched it, like a child clings to a secret. I began but didn't finish. He nodded once, sharply, still watching me, still unmoved. I walked out of the room without looking back, even though my entire spine begged me to turn around. Downstairs. I busied myself again, hands in dishwater, eyes on nothing. My husband entered, whistling lightly, holding a bag of groceries. I greeted him with a kiss on the cheek and asked about the parking. He started talking about traffic, sales, paper towels. I nodded in all the right places, smiled. Where expected. But inside everything had changed. Something inside me had woken up. Something that would not, could not, be put back to sleep. Later that night, in our bed, he reached for me. Gently, dutifully, I let him. But when his hands touched my waist, I felt nothing. Not revulsion, not connection, just air, like he was holding the shell of a woman I no longer was. I turned my head toward the window and let him finish what he believed was love, because I already knew where my body wanted to belong, and I hated myself for knowing it. The next day, I woke up before everyone else. There was something disturbingly proper about that morning, the kind of quiet that didn't feel like peace, but like something unseen moving beneath the surface. I slipped on a thick cardigan over a light tank top and walked barefoot across the wooden floor into the kitchen. The coffee machine hummed like it had read my thoughts. I stood by the window, watching the garden slowly fill with light. Everything looked ordinary, and that ordinary terrified me more than any change ever could. When he came down, I heard the creak of the stairs first. He was up early too silent, too composed. We pretended nothing had happened. I slid a mug toward him. He poured himself some coffee. His hand trembled slightly, and I pretended not to notice. We stood side by side, too close for a kitchen, too far for what had passed between us. He broke the silence first. I shouldn't have, he said almost in a whisper. I didn't answer right away. The version of me that existed before, the convenient, quiet one, would have said something soothing like, "It's okay," or "It didn't mean anything." But now, even breathing beside him felt different. "Don't start with that," I said, calmer than I expected. "Nothing happens without a reason." He looked down into his cup. I could feel him holding back. Words, emotions, maybe even the instinct to flee. That restraint held more tension than if he had shouted. I finished my coffee without looking at him and stepped out into the garden. I spent the rest of the day on autopilot. My husband had gone into the city for a meeting, oblivious as always. I cleaned things that didn't need cleaning, watered the plants, replied to emails. But every moment was soaked in something between guilt and memory. Every step in the hallway, every glance toward the stairs, everything pulled me back to that room, to that kiss. Later, closer to evening, I went into the laundry room, just the eye, smell of detergent and warm fabric. I was pulling damp clothes from the machine when I heard the door open. I turned. He was standing there, unsure, like he didn't quite know why he'd come. His eyes flicked over my neck, my sleeves, my bare feet. I placed the last towel on the pile and straightened. He stepped closer, stopping just a breath away. "I think," he started, then stopped. I looked at him, feeling something tighten deep in my chest. We were standing in that cramped space, surrounded by steam and the scent of soap. And suddenly I knew, whatever this was between us, it wasn't a mistake. It had its own breath, its own pulse, growing stronger every time we stayed silent. "I feel like," I said, locking eyes with him, "you're one of the few people who actually sees me." He moved closer, not touching, not asking, just letting the air between us change shape. And in that pause, between breath and decision, I realized something. My heart wasn't afraid anymore. It was waiting. "You shouldn't feel that way about me," he said, barely audible. I smiled sadly. I didn't choose who to feel it for. It just happened. He went quiet again, but his expression shifted. Something softened. He walked to the shelf, picked up a towel. Meaningless movement. Something to fill space. I stepped aside to let him pass. Our shoulders brushed. Not by accident, not anymore. After dinner, my husband turned on the TV and invited us both to join him for the game. I sat curled under a throw blanket with a glass of wine. His son sat across from me. We all faced the screen, pretending to care about who was winning. But between us, between me and him, something much more volatile was playing out. Our eyes never met. That made it worse. Every movement felt amplified. I noticed how he rubbed his jaw, tilted his head, clenched his fingers, and I knew. He noticed me just the same. My husband was talking about work, laughing, gesturing like nothing had changed. I smiled at the right moments. I nodded. But something inside me was pulling, aching, blooming. It wasn't just desire. It was the realization of how long I had been invisible. Later that night, we all retreated. To our separate corners of the house, I stood in front of my mirror, wiping off makeup, brushing my hair. I looked at myself not like a woman who'd made a mistake, but like someone standing at the edge of something too vast to name. And I thought, if that kiss hadn't happened, would we really have gone back to life as it was? Or was something in me always waiting for a reason to unravel? I pulled open my drawer and stared at the silk set I hadn't worn in years. I closed it again slowly. Something was breaking, and something else, something dangerous, electric, was beginning. The following morning arrived heavy with humidity. As if the air itself refused to be touched, I moved through the house like I was made of glass. Carefully, quietly, deliberately. Every floorboard felt louder beneath my feet. Every door creak a confession. My husband had left early again. A meeting, he said, followed by errands. He kissed my cheek as he always did, not noticing how my body stayed still under the motion. I closed the door behind him, not with longing, not with relief, but with a blankness I hadn't known I was capable of. The silence he left behind wasn't emptiness. It was opportunity. That realization didn't arrive like a choice. It was more like a shadow sliding across the floor before you notice what's casting it. I sat at the table with a cup of tea, flipping through an unread magazine, not processing a single page. I was waiting for something I didn't name. The sound of the stairs gave me my answer. He came down in a plain white t-shirt, hair still wet from a shower. The scent of clean skin and warm water drifted in with him, and it hit me harder than I wanted to admit. He nodded as he passed the table, his eyes pausing on mine just long enough. I didn't return the gesture. I couldn't, not without giving something away. We kept to opposite ends of the house for hours. He worked on something in the garage. I rearranged books I hadn't touched in months, dusted shelves that were already clean. I opened drawers and closed them again, as if meaning might be tucked inside the linen. It was only around mid-afternoon that I passed through the hallway and saw him sitting on the back porch, shirt clinging to his skin from the heat, a glass of lemonade in his hand, staring out into the yard like it owed him something. I don't remember deciding to join him. My body made the choice for me. I stepped outside and sat in the chair beside him. Not a word was spoken. We both stared ahead, watching the breeze stir the tops of the trees, pretending this was just another warm day. After a long pause, he said without turning, "This house is quieter than I remember." "It's not always like this," I replied, though we both knew it was. He leaned back in his chair, tilting it slightly, his legs stretched out long in front of him, almost touching mine. "It feels like a place people come to wait for something or to forget." I didn't answer because he was right. That's what my life had become. A waiting room for emotions I had no permission to feel. I looked at his hands, sunlit and still, hands that had touched my face 2 days ago, that had brushed my waist, that I hadn't stopped thinking about. I crossed my legs, more out of discomfort. With myself than with him, I could feel the heat rising beneath my dress. Not from shame, but from memory. A mosquito landed on my arm. He reached over and brushed it away without warning, his fingers lingering a moment longer than necessary. I didn't flinch. Neither of us said a word about it. The sky darkened slightly with the approach of evening. He stood up and stretched, the hem of his shirt rising just enough to reveal the curve of his hip, the line that disappeared into his jeans. I turned my head away. "Late. I'm going to start dinner," I said almost too casually. He didn't respond, just nodded and went inside ahead of me. Dinner passed like theater. I cooked mechanically, set the table, served portions. He helped without being asked. We moved in practiced silence. My husband came home just as I was pouring wine. He kissed me on the cheek again, like we were reenacting marriage instead of living it. He talked about traffic, about someone from work having a divorce. about how lucky we were to have peace at home. I nodded, smiled, asked the right questions. I laughed at the right times. The air felt thick in my throat. After dinner, my husband turned on the television and invited us both to watch something. I made excuses about laundry and stepped away. In the quiet of the hallway, I leaned against the wall and exhaled slowly, trying to slow my pulse. The weight in my chest wasn't fear. It was anticipation. Later that night, I stood in front of my mirror again. I took longer undressing, not from vanity, but from indecision. I stood in my slip, bare-legged, brushing my hair, feeling the air. Against my skin in a way I hadn't let myself feel in years, my reflection didn't look remorseful. It looked awake. There was a knock, quiet, tentative. I opened the bedroom door a crack and found him standing there in the hallway. Not too close, not too far, just there. I couldn't sleep, he said, voice low. I didn't move, didn't answer. I looked at him like he was the final step in a long equation I had already solved. You shouldn't be here, I whispered. He nodded. I know. And yet neither of us moved. I didn't let him in. He didn't ask to be let in, but something passed between us in that moment. Something electric and painful and full of gravity. When he turned and walked away, I watched his back until it disappeared around the corner. I closed the door gently, then sat on the edge of the bed, heart pounding, lips dry, the silence in the yow. Room roared louder than any argument. We were no longer waiting, we were circling. The day he left the glass on the counter was the same day I stopped trying to resist it. It wasn't a grand moment, not a cinematic revelation. It was small, subtle, a nearly empty glass of orange juice left behind without ceremony, the condensation pooling slowly into a ring. I stared at it longer than I should have, as though it could explain what was happening to me or why I was letting it. My husband had left early again. Some urgent issue with a vendor he couldn't delegate. He rarely asked if I wanted to come along anymore. I don't know when he stopped asking. Maybe around the same time I stopped imagining that I would say yes. The house felt emptier than usual. Not quiet. Empty. There's a difference. Silence can be comforting, even necessary. Emptiness is colder. A reminder of how much space we build around ourselves when we stop needing to be seen. I moved through the kitchen slowly, fingertips grazing the marble counter, tracing invisible patterns. I was wearing the pale blue blouse he once said made me look graceful. My husband, not the boy. It had been too long since I wore it for that reason. It clung differently now. Softer in some places, tighter in others. Age has a way of settling into fabric before it reaches your bones. I knew where he was. He always spent mornings on the porch now, tinkering with his camera, fiddling with settings he already understood. A way to keep his hands busy, maybe, or to avoid using them for something else. I stood behind the curtain, just out of view, and watched him. The light touched his face so precisely it made my breath catch. He looked up. I let the curtain fall. I didn't intend to find him later. It just happened. I went into the laundry room with every intention of doing what I always did. Fold, sort, repeat. But he was already there, crouched near the dryer, pulling out a heap of warm towels. He didn't look surprised to see me. You're always doing laundry, I said, because I had to say something. It keeps me from thinking, he replied. I nodded and stepped past him to the counter, reaching for the basket. When I turned around, he was standing, not moving, watching me. You're not what I expected, he said. The silence that followed felt heavy, not because of the words, but because of how much was missing between them. I don't think I am either, I answered, my voice thinner than I meant it to be. And then, without planning, without warning, I closed the distance between us. The room was warm, the hum of the dryer loud in my ears. His hands were at his sides, mine were clenched into fists. I didn't reach for him. Not at first, it was him. He stepped in, one movement, one decision. His fingers brushed my cheek, the simplest touch, yet it burned like fire against my skin. There was no hesitation this time. Our mouths met with something raw, need, guilt, confusion, desire, all stitched into a single moment. There was nothing delicate about it, nothing rehearsed. His hand moved behind my neck, holding me in place like he was afraid I'd vanish. I gripped his shirt, pulling him closer, pressing my body against his like it belonged there. The dryer buzzed. Neither of us moved. His lips found my jaw, then my shoulder, my breath caught, not from fear, not from shame, but from the way his skin felt against mine, as though it had been waiting for this contact since long before I acknowledged it. Then the world snapped back. Footsteps upstairs, floorboards shifting. We froze. His hands loosened their hold. Mine dropped away. I stepped back first, tugging at my blouse, smoothing my hair. He exhaled. Long, controlled, like he'd practiced that moment 1,000 times. "Don't say anything," I whispered. He nodded once, his gaze never leaving mine. And then he picked up the laundry basket and walked out, as if nothing had happened. But everything had. The rest of the day passed in pieces. I cleaned things that didn't need cleaning, rearranged towels, deleted old voicemails. My husband returned around 5, tired and complaining about parking. I asked the right questions, smiled at the right times, sat beside him on the couch, legs crossed neatly, heart silent. When he touched my hand, I flinched, so slightly I hoped he hadn't noticed. That night I dreamed I was underwater, not drowning, just suspended, floating, unable to speak or scream, but at peace with the silence. When I woke, I was tangled in the sheets, the side of the bed where he used to sleep now cool and untouched. I walked barefoot into the hallway. His door was open. The room was dark, but not empty. He was sitting on the edge of the bed, shirtless, elbows on knees, staring at the floor like it held answers. He didn't look up when I entered. I didn't speak. I sat beside him, careful not to touch. We stayed like that for what felt like hours, two silhouettes in a house pretending to sleep, breathing in sync, both knowing the line we crossed could never be redrawn, and neither of us wanted to. The summer heat began to settle into the walls like an unwanted guest. Even with the windows cracked open and fans humming throughout the house, the air felt too still, too saturated. I moved more slowly, as though my body had grown heavier from everything it was holding. And yet, strangely, I didn't feel numb. I felt sharpened, on edge, alert, aware of every movement around me, of his footsteps upstairs, of my husband's absent-minded sighs as he scrolled through emails, of the way my own breathing changed when I passed by the door to the guest room. Days after what had happened between us in the laundry room, we spoke only when absolutely necessary. Not out of shame, at least not on my part, but because words suddenly felt like a threat to whatever fragile thing we had touched. A name given too early might kill it. My husband, as always, remained oblivious, not because he was cruel or distant, but because he had trained himself to stop looking closely. That was how he coped with life, by trusting the shape of things, never inspecting the details. He believed I was the same woman he married. He believed his son was simply recovering from something unspoken, and I let him believe it, because undoing that illusion would mean tearing down the very structure I had helped him build. One evening, the three of us sat outside, the light fading slowly as the heat settled into our skin. My husband poured wine for us, half a glass each, and talked about refinancing the house, something he'd been considering. I nodded when appropriate. I laughed once, although I didn't hear the joke. He put his hand on my knee under the table. Casual, proprietary, I didn't move away. But I also didn't feel anything. Not revulsion, not warmth, just neutrality. His touch was familiar in a way that made me ache. Not for him, but for how I used to respond, for the version of me that hadn't known what was missing. Across the table, his son watched the conversation with polite detachment. His glass remained mostly full. His hand hovered near his fork but never lifted it. Every now and then, our eyes met, and every time they did, something inside my chest clenched, then softened, like muscle remembering how to stretch again after years of tension. Later that night, I lay in bed with the lights off, staring at the ceiling fan spinning its slow, hypnotic circles. My husband snored lightly beside. Me, I could hear the soft thud of footsteps down the hall. Not approaching, just moving. I imagined him pacing, restless like me. I imagined his hands running through his hair, his mind circling the same impossibilities mine was. The next morning, my husband surprised me with breakfast. He brought it. To me on a tray, scrambled eggs, toast, coffee just the way I liked it, he said, smiling. Thought you deserved a slow morning? I smiled back, thanked him, kissed his cheek. I even reached for his hand, squeezed it gently. It wasn't a performance. It was muscle memory. I told myself I was being kind. That's what wives do. They say thank you for gestures that come too late or too rarely. They absorb the affection their husbands are finally willing to offer and say, this is enough. But as he left the room and closed the door behind him, I sat motionless with the tray on my lap, staring at the coffee as though it might confess something. Later that day, I ran errands alone. I parked in a grocery store lot and sat there for 10 minutes before going inside. I couldn't remember what I needed. I walked the aisles slowly, touching items without taking them. I bought things I didn't usually buy. Seasonal fruit, scented soap, a new set of placemats, little changes, unimportant ones. But they felt like something. When I returned, the house was quiet again. My husband was working upstairs. I found his son in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, chopping vegetables without looking at them. I leaned against the counter, letting the grocery bag sit at my feet. He didn't speak. Neither did I. After a while, he said, I think I should leave soon. The words hit me harder than I expected. Why? I asked, though I already knew. He shrugged. Because this house doesn't feel like a place I can stay. I looked down at my hands, at the red indentations left by the plastic. Bag handles. You think it's easier to leave than to stay and pretend nothing's happening? He turned to face me then. I don't think either is easy. I nodded once, slowly. I don't want to pretend, I said. That was all I said. And I left the room. That night, I put on the lingerie I hadn't worn in over a year. It wasn't for seduction. It wasn't for anyone, really. I just wanted to feel something on my skin that reminded me I had a body that once ached to be touched. That still could. I lay in bed awake for hours. When I finally drifted off, my dreams were fragmented. Shadows, doors closing, his hands, my reflection in a mirror I didn't recognize. A voice saying my name, not in warning but in wonder. When I woke, I felt different, like something had shifted for good. Like the version of me I had tried to keep contained was now pacing, barefoot and unafraid, behind my eyes. It happened on a Wednesday. A day so ordinary it almost mocked me. The sky was overcast, the kind of dull gray that seemed to flatten everything it touched. I spent the morning cleaning the upstairs bathroom, scrubbing the tiles harder than necessary, as if the grout between them could absorb what I couldn't say aloud. The radio played softly in the background. Old songs from the 70s, crooning about regret and time lost. My husband was home that day, working remotely from his upstairs office. His voice drifted, down occasionally, muffled through the closed door, full of polite authority as he spoke with clients. I used to find comfort in his voice. Now it felt like white noise, polished, distant, predictable. I passed him once in the hallway, and he kissed me on the head without pausing, just the press. Of lips to hair, mechanical, habitual. I stood still after he'd gone, touched the place where he'd kissed me. It felt cold. I didn't see his son until the afternoon. He was outside, cleaning out the shed. He had stripped off his shirt, sweat, lining his collarbones, a smear of dust along one side of his torso. I watched from the upstairs window, hidden behind the sheer curtain, the way a person watches something they know they're not supposed to want, but can't stop craving. He looked up suddenly. Our eyes met. I didn't move away. That evening, after dinner, my husband fell asleep early. He'd been complaining of a headache and took something for it. He left his plate half-eaten and climbed the stairs slowly, his posture sagging in a way I hadn't noticed before. I stayed downstairs, rinsing dishes I'd already washed, letting the warm water numb my fingers. The house was quiet again, too. Quiet. I stepped outside barefoot, the porch light casting a dim yellow halo onto the wooden boards. The night was thick with the scent of jasmine and something else. Maybe the earth, maybe myself. I found him behind the house near the shed. He was sitting on an overturned crate, cigarette between his fingers, though he wasn't smoking it, just holding it. The tip was still dry. He didn't seem surprised to see me, didn't speak. I walked toward him and stopped just a few feet away. The ground was cool beneath my feet, the air still holding the weight of the day's heat. He looked up. "I saw you today," he said. I nodded. "I know." He stood slowly, not threatening, not timid, just certain. "What are we doing?" he asked. His voice didn't tremble. I didn't answer, because if I had said it aloud, I would have shattered something between us, something we hadn't named, but both held in our hands like glass. Instead, I stepped forward. We didn't touch. Not yet. We simply stood in the silence, letting it fold around us like another kind of intimacy, the kind that doesn't need to be spoken, only felt. "I think I'd rather be damned, honestly," I said finally, "than live the rest of my life pretending. I'm fine." His jaw clenched slightly, not in anger, but restraint. He moved closer, so close I could feel the warmth of his breath. "I'm not leaving," he said. He reached into his back pocket, pulled out a small photograph, and held it out to me. I took it. It was a picture of us, blurry, taken from a distance. In the backyard, I was handing him something. Our fingers were touching. We weren't looking at the camera. We were looking at each other. The image pulsed with a quiet intimacy that made my heart stutter. "Where did this come from?" I whispered. He shook his head. "I found it slipped under the garage door this morning. No note, just that." My stomach sank. Someone knew. The realization spread like ice through my veins, dull at first, then cutting. It wasn't just between us anymore. It had spilled beyond the frame. We stood there, holding the proof between us. The picture trembled slightly in my fingers. "Do you think it was him?" I asked. "I don't know," he said. "Maybe. Maybe not. But it doesn't change what we are. It just makes it harder to lie about." I tucked the photo into my sweater pocket and turned back toward the house. Inside, my husband was asleep. The house creaked softly, as if aware of what it was now sheltering. I stood at the doorway of our bedroom, watching him breathe, the slow rise and fall of his chest, the peaceful slack of his mouth. He looked younger in sleep, uncomplicated. I stepped back and closed the door. Down the hall, another door waited, one I had avoided for too long. I knocked when it opened. There were no words, just eyes and breath, and two people standing in the echo of what they were becoming. We didn't touch, not yet, but we would. And this time, I wouldn't stop it. The photograph never left my sweater pocket. I carried it with me for the next 2 days like a splinter buried too deep to pull out. I would reach for it without thinking. When I was folding laundry, when I was stirring pasta, even once while I was brushing my teeth, I never looked at it for long, just a few seconds each time, but it was enough to stir something low and electric in my chest. A reminder that nothing was hidden anymore. Or at least, not as well as it used to be. Whoever took the picture had seen us. That was now a certainty. They had seen the way we looked at each other. Something so small, so ordinary on the surface, and yet it betrayed everything. A flick of the eye, a tilt of the head. The body always knows before the voice admits it. I didn't tell him I kept the photo. I didn't ask if he had a copy. I think we both knew that what mattered wasn't the image, but the intent behind it. The threat. The silent pressure of being seen by someone we hadn't invited into our world. My husband noticed a shift in me. Of course he did, but not in the way I expected. He began bringing me little things. A new kitchen towel with a pattern he thought I'd like, a scented candle he picked up during lunch. He'd stand behind me while I cooked and rest his hands lightly on my hips, as if retracing the memory of a relationship we'd both long since rewritten. He asked once, out of nowhere, "You okay?" I turned around, smiled, nodded. Just tired. It was always the safe answer, but the truth was I'd never felt more awake. Every touch, every glance, every silence in the house now pulsed with tension. Thick, heady, irreversible. That evening, I sat on the front porch alone. The sun was setting in streaks of pale pink and copper. The way it does only in early summer, just before everything starts to burn, I sipped from a glass of lukewarm white wine, tracing the rim with one finger. The neighborhood was quiet. Children already inside, sprinklers clicking off one by one. He joined me without speaking, just sat in the chair beside mine and exhaled like he'd been holding his breath all day. Neither of us said anything for a while. Eventually, I asked, "Do you think it was him?" He didn't answer immediately. He picked at the edge of the chair cushion, then looked out at the sidewalk. "No," he said. "He's too busy pretending nothing's wrong, whoever it was. They're watching, but not him. Not yet. Phi." Way he said "not yet" sent a chill down my back. Even in the warmth of the evening, I took another sip of wine. "You know we're going to hurt him," I said softly. "I know." The words didn't come with guilt, only inevitability. That night, after my husband fell asleep, I stood at the foot of our bed for a long time, just watching him. His breathing was steady, lips slightly parted, one arm draped across his stomach. He looked peaceful, innocent, even. And I felt something twist in me. Not quite regret, not quite affection, just a kind of mourning for the version of myself that used to reach for him in the dark without hesitation. I slipped into the hallway barefoot. The door to the guest room opened before I could knock. He stood there, hair tousled, shirt clinging to his chest from the heat. There were no words this time. I stepped inside and he closed the door behind me. The room was dim, lit only by the faint light leaking in from the hallway. I stood by the window, hands wrapped around my elbows. Not quite cold, but needing to hold something. He moved closer, slowly, carefully. Like he wasn't sure I'd stay, I didn't turn. When he spoke, "I don't want to be the mistake you hide." "You're not," I said, "but I don't know what that makes you yet." He stood behind me, his breath brushing the curve of my shoulder. He didn't touch me. You don't have to know. We stayed like that. Me facing the glass, him behind me. Both of us suspended in the kind of quiet that only exists between two people at the edge of something permanent. Eventually, I turned. He was closer than I expected. I reached up and touched his cheek, slowly, the way someone traces an old scar. He closed his eyes, leaned into my hand. I didn't pull away. He whispered, "You're shaking." "I know." His hands found my waist, tentative at first, then sure. I rested my forehead against his chest and let the silence say what we couldn't. And in that moment, I stopped thinking about right and wrong, about marriage, names, titles. I thought only of how his hands felt on me. New and yet familiar, like music I used to know. When I finally slipped back into my own room, it was nearly dawn. I peeled off my clothes in the dark and lay beside my husband, careful not to wake him. He shifted slightly in his sleep and mumbled my name, a soft, empty echo. I stared at the ceiling and knew, with absolute clarity, that we were too far gone. By the end of the week, something inside the house had cracked, not broken in the dramatic, cinematic way. No doors slammed, no voices raised. It was subtler, like a window had been left open overnight, and now all the furniture carried a faint trace of rain. My husband moved through the rooms with that same warm blindness he always had. He hummed in the mornings, offered to make coffee, left his laptop charger in the kitchen. But every word he spoke felt delayed, like it was traveling from some other version of reality where I still belonged to him completely. I found myself studying his face more often now. Not out of love or guilt, but out of curiosity. I wondered how long it would take him to notice. To really notice. The difference in the way I touched him. Gentler, more mechanical. The way I no longer leaned into his hand when he cupped the back of my neck. The way I pulled my robe tighter before walking past him. Not out of modesty, but out of disinterest. He was looking for something to repair, but I wasn't offering him anything broken. What was lost wasn't shattered. It had been carefully, quietly removed, taken somewhere else, somewhere I kept returning to. That Saturday, we were invited to a neighbor's barbecue. I wore a floral sundress and let my hair fall in loose waves. He complimented me before we left, said I looked beautiful. I smiled, thanked him, kissed his cheek. The routine of it all would have been comforting if it didn't feel like acting in a play I had outgrown. He stood behind me at the gathering, one hand on my lower back as we mingled. I laughed when I was supposed to, complimented the wine, nodded through stories about garden renovations. But every time I caught sight of him, across the lawn, drink in hand, sunglasses sliding down his nose, I felt something inside me stir. Later, that evening after the party, the three of us returned home. My husband went upstairs to take a shower. I stayed in the kitchen, rinsing glasses, letting the water run too long. He entered quietly. I didn't turn. "I'm leaving tomorrow," he said. I froze. My hand gripped the glass tighter than necessary. I turned slowly. He was standing there, arms crossed, jaw tight. "I can't stay here. Not like this. Not with him smiling at me like I'm still a kid and you pretending nothing's happening." I took a breath, but it didn't reach my lungs. "You think leaving fixes it?" I asked. "No, I think staying would ruin it." I hated how much sense that made. He stepped closer. "I didn't plan this," I said quietly. "I know. I didn't want you. I know. But I do." He closed the distance between us, and before either of us could say another word, I kissed him. It wasn't impulsive. It wasn't reckless. It was the kiss of someone who had finally stopped apologizing to herself. It was slower this time, not searching, not desperate, just full of the weight of everything we hadn't said. My hands pressed against his chest, feeling his heartbeat race beneath my palms. He held my face like it was something fragile, and for a moment, I wished I was. Then a sound. Footsteps above us. I pulled away. We both stood still, listening. My husband's steps, the familiar rhythm of him crossing the hallway, entering the bedroom. I looked at the clock, nearly midnight. He leaned his forehead against mine. I closed my eyes. "You'll really leave tomorrow?" I asked. "Yes." "Will you tell him?" "No. I'm not sure what to do. I don't think you have to know yet." I nodded, barely. And just like that, we parted. No final touch, no farewell. Just two bodies that knew they couldn't meet again without consequences. That night, I lay in bed beside a man who believed I belonged to him. His hand reached for mine in his sleep. I let it, not because I wanted to, but because I couldn't bear to yank it away. The next morning, he was gone. He left no note, no message, only the glass of orange juice on the counter, half full, condensation dripping down the sides. I stared at it for a long time. I told my husband he left early, that he had some freelance job lined up in another state. He nodded, unsurprised. "He always runs," he said. But I knew this wasn't running. It was mercy. The days passed slowly after that. I moved through them like walking in a dream that had begun to fade. The house was too quiet again, but not in the way it used to be. Now it echoed, it remembered. I kept the photograph, tucked in a book I never finished. Sometimes I still open to that page, not to mourn, not to regret, but to remember the version of myself who had once stood at the edge of something wild and chosen, even for a moment, to leap.